Hey Optimancers, Chris here. In my last video I discussed the issues with the longsword in optimized play and did an exhaustive search for everything we can do on our character build to make this challenging weapon inflict more damage. Today I'm going to go through a bit of math on some builds I considered in order to make an effective longsword user, but before that let's just go over some basic considerations I had going in. The first is I didn't want to bother with the poisoner feat. As I mentioned in my last video, I think it's definitely worth a conversation with your DM regarding this feat if it fits with your character concept. But because so much is in the hands of the DM here, I didn't want to bother with it. Second was how to effectively increase damage. So there's two ways we can increase damage. We can increase our chance to hit, or we can increase our damage through bonuses to damage. My math indicated that straight bonuses to damage are more effective, especially at lower levels. And once we have some decent damage bonuses, then bonuses to hit, like advantage, give us a bigger boost. This is a bit different than if you're using Sharpshooter or Great Weapon Master, because with the -5 to hit and +10 damage, hitting is a bigger challenge, and the rewards of hitting are amplified by that +10. In the case of Longsword, without this kind of amplification, the base chance to hit is already higher, but the stakes of hitting are lower, so bonuses to damage basically beat out bonuses to hit. Finally, if you were looking for the highest DPR build available, you shouldn't be using a longsword. That just isn't going to work. But if your character is going to use the most iconic weapon in fantasy, and that's part of your concept, then you want a build that at least does reasonable damage, and doesn't get completely overshadowed by the Polar Master and the hand crossbow user. And as far as that goes, I do have some solutions today. Because our damage isn't spectacular, I thought it'd be optimal to make sure our character can complement weapon attacks with some other useful options. So that was a consideration in my build. I'm just going to quickly go over how I analyze the damage potential of the options. First, I have a baseline for damage per round. This is based on a warlock that increases their charisma when they can, takes agonizing blast, casts the hex spell, and uses eldritch blast. Now, if you want to know more about how I calculate damage, there is a link in the video description. A warlock can do more damage than my baseline, but any warlock should be able to deliver the baseline damage. I apply no subclass, no feats, so this damage is okay. Strong build that is built to deliver damage should be able to deliver somewhere between 50% and double this baseline. There are points at some levels with some builds that a longsword user can get pretty close to that 50% mark, but over 20 levels, nothing I could build came close to that point. Now, when you calculate DPR, you have to guess how long your adventuring day is going to be. And that is going to vary from table to table, and it is going to vary from session to session. Sometimes you might only have one combat. That combat might only last a few rounds. In other times, you might have a very long day where you're going from combat to combat. And I generally use that worst case scenario. So I'll use 8 combats, 1 short rest in between, 4 rounds per combat on average. And that is much higher than you should expect on average. Like I said, it is a worst case scenario, but I as a player have experienced that, and as a DM I've run it. So it can happen. And why I like the longer day is because if we're talking about builds that really rely on Nova damage, this is where you expend a ton of resources to do a lot of damage over a short duration. I find those builds frustrating personally, because when you have these longer adventuring days, there's a lot of time they just can't do anything. So with a longer adventuring day, I can judge how well they're going to do overall in a day. A little bit better, I think. But there's nothing wrong with doing DPR with a shorter adventuring day if that's what you experience. Just be aware that if you were to reduce the size of the adventuring day, these numbers would be higher. Now, if you think that you will never have an adventuring day that long, no problem. I show my math so you can adjust it easily enough for a shorter adventuring day, but the short of it is the numbers will be higher. I've been told a number of times actually that maybe I should use a fighter with a longsword for my baseline instead of the warlock. So you know what? Let's start there. So I built a champion fighter. I took the dueling fighting style, increased strength to 20 by level 6. Afterwards, I basically picked up any feat that could even marginally increase my damage. Savage Attacker, Fey Touch for Hunter's Mark, Lucky for some rerolls, Martial Adept, and then I compared those results to the baseline. So here's where we ended up. Red is the baseline and blue is the champion. We see it falls below baseline pretty consistently for the first 7 levels, then it, for the most part, mimics the baseline for the rest of the way. In fact, if we average out all these results, the champion ended up almost exactly at the baseline. Below, but by less than 1%. So, if anyone here figures the champion with Longsword should be the baseline, well, you know what? It almost is. As for an effective character, this is not. Meeting baseline and being able to deliver nothing except for damage is not optimal. It is enough that your damage wouldn't be completely irrelevant, but it's just not great. I did try straight Paladin. I figured there was a damage boost at 11 with improved Divine Smite, some decent offensive options through subclasses, spell options, and of course smites. I didn't punch the math at all 20 levels because what I punched was level 11 and it was low enough that I didn't figure that the build was going to work, and it was just going to get worse at level 17. I punched out a number of different options. Here is my runner-up build. I took a fighter dip, then Bladesinger for 6 levels, then 2 levels of Paladin, and then back to Wizard right up to level 20, so eventually we would get 9th level spells. This build put almost all their first 4 spell levels into smites. Booming Blade with the extra attack for additional damage boosts, and yes, I even used my normally hated Tensor's Transformation when they got 6th level spells, eventually switching to Foresight plus Upcast Spirit Shrouds at level 20. And you know something? The damage actually looks pretty decent after level 6. Levels 5 and 6 hurt though, and this just is not a typical Bladesinger. Here's how I had to arrange the stats. So we have a strength of 17, but look at that, intelligence 13, charisma 13. So this is not a strong paladin, this is not a strong wizard in terms of ability scores. Now these stats were required in order to do the multiclassing required, and yeah, it's a tough multiclass to do Bladesinger and Paladin. Essentially it makes Bladesong almost useless, and of course there's no point taking Paladin above level 2 because Aura Protection wouldn't do much for us. That dexterity means we're going to have a terrible initiative score, and we don't have a ton of hit points with this character either. 14 Constitution is passable, but it's not great. But basically, multiclassing Paladin and Bladesinger isn't pretty, and this is not a pretty build by any stretch. We don't use the majority of our subclass features, and spells are pretty much universally spent on damage boosts. So none of the tricks you would normally expect from a Bladesinger, so honestly, the Tensor's Transformation didn't end up being the huge sacrifice it normally is. I shouldn't say it doesn't have any tricks. Like, I was able to conserve the 8th level spell slot, so you could throw a maze once per day, and that doesn't care about your low casting stat. And of course, we should have a decent array of ritual options. We end up 25% over the baseline on average, so we're beating Champion Fighter by a fair degree, but we're basically halfway between the baseline and achieving strong damage, and other than a couple things, for the most part, we're just a damage dealer. It was clear to me we needed to combine damage above the baseline with some other decent options to get an effective character with a longsword. The solution actually wasn't that complicated. I did a Hex 1 dip, then Swords Bard the rest of the way. So yeah, I'm literally in the middle of editing this video, and editing isn't the most fun thing, so I take a break, and my notifications come up that the Dungeon Dudes just posted a Hexblade Swords Bard video. So I panic at first, then I calm myself down. Surely it's not going to be the same build I'm about to present. And then I watch the video, and yeah, it's not exactly the same, but it is close. Then I start to wonder, should I just abandon this video entirely? But you know what? I've already released my last Longsword video to patrons, promising that I'd make this video. And I punched all that math, and I figure, you know, that's one thing I can cover that the dudes didn't cover. So we're going to look at how the math plays out here. So if we do Hex and Swords, this is where our damage ends up. The green is the Swords Bard with the Hex dip, red is baseline, and blue is the Champion Fighter. You can see overall, we're ahead of both the Fighter and baseline. And you'll see we have loads of options beyond what a Fighter can do. We dip below baseline at level 17, and that's the only level of all 20 that happens. And, you know, there is a way we can get over 17 too if we want to, and I will discuss that when we get there. Now I want to point out, we have a couple spots around here where we're enough above baseline that if you don't want to concentrate on a damage booster, you can get away with it and we still beat baseline. That's levels 7 through 10, by the way. So here is how we're going to get there. Number one, we're going to start with custom lineage, and we will grab the Fey Touched feat. You could take telekinetic if you like. Personally, I like getting Misty Step on a bard, and we have that first level spell. And we're only going to have 2 warlock selections for spells, and I want 3. Though if you can take Dunamancy spells, Gift of Alacrity is great. If you can use Strixhaven spells, Silvery Barbs is great. But I'm going to recommend we pick up Hex here. Hunter's Mark is another option. Hunter's Mark is actually probably more reliable in terms of damage than Hex. The nice thing about Hex is if we are stuck at range, we can add our Hex to our Eldritch Blasts. And if you want to see all the selections I made, there is a link in the video description for the character sheet as it ended up at 20th level. But with custom lineage and with Fey Touched, we're going to be starting with an 18 Charisma, and we're going to use Hex Warrior to tie our Longsword to Charisma for our attacks. So yeah, Hexblade, that needs to be our first level. From levels 1 through 6, I figure we might as well use Booming Blade. Now I recently did a video where I discussed how I've probably been inflating Booming Blade's secondary damage on builds when they have no special way to encourage that secondary damage from happening. Up to this point, I've always used 50% for secondary damage regardless. But starting with this video, I'm going to be reducing that to 25% unless we have a reliable way to leave melee each turn, thus making the secondary damage more likely. This build doesn't have that. I mean, we have Misty Step once, right? But that's not enough. So 25 secondary damage is what I used here. From level 7, we'll use extra attack, so it doesn't matter after then. For our other cantrip, probably just grab Eldritch Blast for a ranged option. We definitely want Shield as one of our Hexblade spells, and Armor of Agathis as the other. When we're not doing damage with spells, generally I'm going to be looking for decent spells with no concentration. In fact, what I really want to do is save my concentration for doing damage and have all my other spells be non-concentration spells that work well with what this character does. Armor of Agathis is one of those spells. It's going to increase our durability, punish our enemies, though I didn't calculate any damage for it because it's pretty hard to predict, and it's going to upcast well with our bard slots. It's no concentration, so it works with what we do. Here's level 1 with the Hex spell and Booming Blade, and we end up just over 10 DPR. That is well over baseline, and is enough to keep us comfortably over baseline until level 5. Then, levels 2 and 3, now we're into Bard. At this time, you might as well use Inspiration just as normal. We're getting more cantrips and spells. Again, stay away from concentration spells. Otherwise, you can take what you like, but I'm going to make some recommendations throughout this video. For cantrips, I'd probably take Minor Illusion and Mage Hand. And then for first level spells, Healing Word, Dissonant Whispers, Featherfall, Silvery Barbs if it's available, maybe Detect Magic. I'll tell you what, I would definitely take Longstrider. Longstrider is a really strong spell if you are a melee character. In fact, it's probably a pretty good spell anyways. And our damage doesn't change at those levels. Then we get to level 4 and we grab the Swordsbard subclass. This gives us 2 different damage boosts. First, we get the Dueling Fighting Style, and that gives us our +2 flat damage. And then we can use our inspiration on Flourishes. So here's the Bardic Flourishes. Whenever you take the attack action on your turn, your walking speed increases by 10 feet until the end of the turn, and if a weapon attack that you make as part of this action hits a creature, you can use one of the following Blade Flourish options of your choice. You can only use one Blade Flourish option per turn. So there are some things to note here. We need to take the attack action to use a Flourish. Once we get extra attack, that's no problem, but until then, at least a few times per day, we're going to be taking the attack action instead of casting Booming Blade on our turn. Assuming a decent length of day, that's still a low percentage of the time, but a Flourish is definitely more potent than Booming Blade, so that's what I would do. All 3 of these options increase our damage by the Bardic Inspiration die in addition to having other effects. Generally, I consider the Defensive Flourish the best one. We also add the result of our die roll to our armor class, and it lasts an entire round. This stacks with shield, and we're already probably in half plate and shield, so that's 19 base armor class, and then we can spike that with shield and with defensive flourish when we need to. Slashing flourish, I would say, is probably the weakest. We do a bit of extra damage to a second enemy with our attack. I mean, technically, we're doubling the damage boost, but we're splitting that damage, and that's a lot less effective. Mobile flourish is okay. You do some force movement, and unlike most force movement, there is neither a saving throw nor a size restriction. Go ahead and look through the other forms of force movement. That's pretty rare. Then we get a reaction move, but that reaction move has to be up to the target. Spread out over a whole day, it's not a lot of damage, but we're going to take every damage boost we can get. And there are the nice add-ons as well. Again, defensive flourish would usually be the one I would use. Now, if we look at the damage graph, you might notice level 4 has a small dip. And with adding dueling and flourish, why did it go down? Well, if we were straight classed, we could have increased our attack ability score, but we multi-classed. So I assume enemy armor classes are going up at this point, but our attack roll hasn't yet. So when I account for chance to hit, our damage dips a bit. For this level anyways. So on to second level bard spells. Do we have any good non-concentration options? Yeah, we do. Blindness Deafness is decent and has a good upcast if we cast it at a higher level. Lesser Restoration is nice to have. You won't need it all the time, but it's handy to have on your list. Pyrotechnics needs some setup, but it's a great non-concentration control spell. Shatter's actually decent as an area of effect blast. And keep in mind that we're going to be using some of these slots, these second level slots, on Misty Step as well. Again, if you want to see what picks I selected, go ahead and take a look in the video description for that link. Otherwise, take your pick of any of those. They're all decent options. At level 5, we get our charisma up to 20. This adds a bonus to hit and damage and gives us another inspiration point. Of course, our spell DC goes up as well. We're just barely squeezing over baseline at this point because we don't have extra attack yet. But the scaled booming blade does help. Still, we're over baseline with 1 attack per round, so no complaints there. We get another spell known. Choose any from the same list we had at the last level. Level 6 gives us a big boost to flourishes. Firstly, they scale to D8s, and secondly, we now get them back on our short rest. That ends up adding about 1.4 damage per round, so it gives us a bit more over baseline. We also get third level spells. If nobody in your party has Leomund's Hut already, pick that up. It's a great spell. Dispel Magic is super useful. Plant Growth is devastating if we have the right terrain. And Plant Growth and Dispel Magic are both good in combat spells that don't use concentration. Level 7 brings us extra attack. We remove the Booming Blade damage, but our overall damage spikes with that extra attack to just over 22 DPR. Baseline at this point is just 16.5, so we're comfortably over now. We also no longer have to worry about using flourishes interfering with Booming Blade, as we won't be using Booming Blade normally anymore. Level 8 gives us 4th level spells. Dimension Door, that's going to be my first pick. Freedom of Movement, also useful. Ralathim's Psychic Lance can be a good anti-caster spell, because if you incapacitate someone, they lose concentration automatically. Now, Greater Invisibility might be tempting, but I have some issues. The one action casting is actually a big problem when you combine it with a 1 minute duration, because basically we're going to be taking a full turn in combat just to set up, and we're using concentration and a high level slot on something that's going to last 1 fight. I'd grab Dimension Door for sure, then Freedom of Movement or Ralathim's Psychic Lance later on. Level 9 boosts our Hexblade Curse damage. We'll grab the Warcaster feat to protect concentration. It actually also helps with our action economy, as we don't have to worry about juggling our Longsword for casting spells anymore. I didn't add any opportunity attack damage though, as we don't have anything like Polar Master to really encourage opportunity attacks. But if we get opportunity attacks, we would do more damage with them, because we would probably use Booming Blade. It's a strong option for Warcaster opportunity attacks. Level 10 gives us no change to our damage, though we could boost it quite a bit if we wanted to spend our 5th level slot on animate objects. But for me, I'd grab Synaptic Static here. Good non-concentration spell. Area of effect damage is pretty misleading if you calculate DPR, because you don't know how many creatures you're going to hit, and even a bigger factor is you're spreading out that damage. but Synaptic Static is also a pretty good non-concentration mass debuff. So I didn't calculate any damage for it, but that's what I would do with that slot, at least at level 10, because I'll be using my 5th level slots for something else right away. At level 11, we get Magical Secrets. Now the first spell I would grab is Find Greater Steed. It just gives a fantastic maneuverability boost. A Pegasus mount is really good, and Find Greater Steed allows you to share spells you cast on yourself with your mount, so Longstrider spells, Armor of Agathis spells, even your Misty Step works on both you and your mount. I'd have it dodge most of the time, and then just move me where I need to be. We now have unlimited concentration free flight with a high movement speed. If we need crazy movement, have it dash. And yes, Longstrider adds to all movement speeds, including flying speeds. So with a dash, that's 200 feet of movement when we need it. And we still have our own actions available. The armor class is not good though, so check with your DM on what kinds of barding a Pegasus can reasonably wear and still bear you as a rider. Take whatever you can get. Any barding will improve the AC. If you can't get barding for it, talk to the party wizard, see if it's possible to get a mage armor. Now if you prefer Counterspell over Find Greater Steed, that is a solid pick too. But one way or the other spell we want is Holy Weapon. Here's the thing about Holy Weapon, that 1 hour duration is massive. So we can probably set it out of combat, but if our concentration drops, we can recast it with a bonus action. So even casting it in combat is something we can do. 2d8 additional damage per attack is a big boost for us. Now I'm going to cut in again here, because the Dungeon Dudes talked about taking Spirit Guardians here, and yeah, Spirit Guardians, good choice. But I talked about in my last video that if you're going to use a Longsword, and then you cast Spirit Guardians, and so we have nothing boosting that Longsword, I seriously wonder whether you should be attacking with that Longsword or just dodging. But with Holy Weapon, we're boosting that Longsword damage. It's single target damage, but we're boosting that damage. So then the Longsword is really our focus. So that's why I went this way rather than Spirit Guardians. I did discuss that in the last video, but since Dungeon Dudes mentioned it specifically, I thought I should actually cut in here and explain again why I'm not taking it. At level 11, the baseline damage jumps quite a bit. Warlocks got their 3rd Eldritch Blast, Fighters got their 3rd attack with extra attack, but with our 2d8 per hit, we managed to squeak over baseline. Holy Weapon also doesn't require us constantly use our bonus action like Hex did, so we can now more freely use things like Misty Step when needed, and those spell slots should all be available. Level 12, we get 6th level spells. Mass Suggestion is one of the best 6th level spells for any class, period. And conveniently, no concentration, snap that one up. Then level 13, and we'll take Resilient Constitution. We gotta get those saving throws. Concentration, now with Warcaster and Resilient Constitution, should be pretty much safe unless we take absolutely massive damage. Level 14, we get a 7th level spell. I think Force Cage is a really obvious option. Again, it's one of the best 7th level spells, period. No concentration, and fortunately for us, it's on the Bard spell list. Level 15, we get a fantastic subclass feature. Now we can flourish on 1 attack every turn for a bonus d6 damage and armor class, assuming we use a defensive flourish. So I would start using my actual inspiration dice on, inspiring allies, and just rely on the d6s for flourishing for now. With the magical secrets, I'd be getting Counterspell. If you want another possible damage option, Draconic Transformation is an option that gives a potent bonus action. Again, it's a high-level slot and only lasts a minute. And you know what? If you want to break your DM's game, Simulacrum does that. If you want a damage option, Steel Wind Strike is pretty cool here. Personally, I'd grab Heal. 70 hit points, can be cast at range, no concentration, one of the few heal spells that's worth casting in the middle of combat on someone who hasn't gone down yet. Oh, and if we cast it on ourselves, we share it with our Pegasus. Okay, but at this point, we need to at least discuss Tensor's Transformation. If you watch this channel, you know I don't like this spell. If you're wielding a longsword though, it is a big damage booster. It is significantly more than Holy Weapon. You can cast spells though, and we're a high level caster. But here's the thing, we're going to hit 17th level and we're not going to meet baseline for the first time for this entire character's career, and the last time. But if you cast Tensors, you're comfortably over the baseline with a Longsword. So I don't want to ignore the option or pretend it doesn't exist. If you want to give up other spell casting to keep damage over baseline at level 17, Tensor's Transformation does this. I personally wouldn't go this way, but I just figure I should mention it. And yeah, you would share Tensors with your Pegasus as well. Level 16 is when we get 8th level spells. There are not a lot of good options here. I would probably grab Feeble Mind, maybe Glibness. Level 17 is the tough level. We don't quite have 9th level spells yet. The baseline jumped up and our damage didn't. This will be the only level of 20 where we fall below baseline, so not too bad. Once again, if you want to be above baseline, if you grab Tensor's Transformation, it'll get you there. But at level 18, we can grab Foresight. This gives us advantage on all attacks we make, along with advantage on pretty much everything else, and disadvantage on attacks against us. Solid 9th level option. We can share Foresight with our mount as well. Now we can use Holy Weapon with concentration, and it is our top damage dealer. I played around with the possibility of Spirit Shroud upcasting, and the damage is basically the same, except with Holy Weapon we save a lot of spell slots. We also don't have that bonus action setup. Holy Weapon is easily castable outside of combat due to its duration. But if we need to cast it in combat, it's still only the bonus action. And we basically coast to 44 DPR from levels 18 right through 20. Baseline is 35, so we're like 25% over. Now, this isn't fantastic damage, but as part of a character that can do other effective things, it's okay. And we can do a lot of other things. We've used our 9th level slot and probably a couple 5th level slots. So what other things can we do besides hit things with our longsword? Well, we have all our inspiration points to hand out, and they're D12s, and they're a bonus action to give out, which we have available in combat. Our 1st level slots, honestly, we're probably using them on shield most of the time. And when we cast shield, by the way, we do share it with our mount. I would probably use a slot for Longstrider though, which also, by the way, is shared with our mount. 2nd level slots for Misty Step bonus action teleports most of the time, I think. Again, our bonus action is available, and we share this spell with our mount as well. 3rd level slots, probably going to use them on counterspell or dispel magic most of the time. 4th level slots, Dimension Doors. Freedom of movement, occasionally at need. Then our 5th level slots, we'll be using those on Holy Weapon. 6th level slots, probably a Mass Suggestion or a heal spell, or maybe an upcast Synaptic Static, probably heal most of the time. 7th level slot, definitely on Force Cage. 8th level slot, I might actually spend it on Glibness, that way our Dispel Magics and Counterspells, which is how we're planning to spend our 3rd level slots anyways, are going to automatically be able to dispel or counter up to 9th level spells. We have advantage on every attack roll, every ability check, every saving throw, and all attacks against us are at disadvantage, and we can get a crazy high armor class. So when it comes to mixing damage with other things, we're full of other options. This is why I don't want to use Tensors. Use Tensor's Transformation and all those things go away. For our final 2 levels, I would continue with Bard. You could switch back to Warlock if you wanted to pick up some invocations, but I would probably stick with Bard because we're going to get Magical Secrets at level 18 and another ability score increase at level 19. So what we end up with is a build that uses Longsword and does okay damage. Level 17 is tough, but for 19 of 20 levels, we're at least over baseline. It does less damage than that Bladesinger Paladin build, but what I like here is we aren't using up our resources all for damage. I mean, if we wanted to, we could multi-class Paladin for 2, and then spend all our extra spell slots on smiting. But if I was playing this character, I'd take the option to cast more spells and do other things than just damage, but still deliver decent damage. We can still sling spells, Misty Step for maneuverability, we have the skill advantages of Bard, our spell DCs are good, we have defensive boosts, we have a nice suite of options besides just hitting stuff, and although we're not dramatically over baseline, we're over baseline. And when you're over baseline, I think those other options basically lead us to a character that is at least decently optimal. One thing I wondered is, if I'm always concentrating on a damage booster, can I fit in a good suite of spells that don't use concentration? And yeah, that didn't end up being a problem at all. If you want to see the finished character with all the selections I would take, there's a link in the video description to the character sheet of how I'd make the build. Honestly, I don't want to mislead anyone and say this is an awesome build. Soon as we put Longsword in our hand, we do limit ourselves. And I knew that restriction would make this build a lot harder. But within that restriction, this was the best way to go in my opinion. And we do end up with a build that I think would perform decently at any optimized table. So that's my deep dive into the Longsword. Hope it's helpful. Otherwise, until next time, I'm going to sit back, relax, and have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thanks everybody, and I'll talk to you soon.